Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014, not in 2022, and it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse, adopt, and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead the U.S. set up a vision of a U.S.-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a U.S. victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the U.S. did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, you know, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. You know, if Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries: the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudence, prudentia, is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the US helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the US was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the US mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the US put in billions of dollars of weaponry. And the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that a set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions? How effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just
try
to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the U.S. using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the U.S. as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president? He is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil because we have to replace the Russian oil? So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no U.S. sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's a starting point. So as soon as the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. This time it was worse, though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the US and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the US secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the US thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off.